Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Alina Polyakova, President and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis, based in Washington, D.C. I'm so honored to host this conversation today to discuss the NATO 2030 Reflection Group report released just 2 weeks ago. As many of you know, around this time last year, Allied leaders and NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg announced a forward-looking reflection process to best position the alliance for 2030. As part of that, the Secretary General appointed a group of high-level experts tasked with producing an independent report with recommendations for strengthening NATO's political dimension and allied cohesion. Then, of course, the pandemic hit, which has meant that since March, the Reflection Group has been very busy conducting almost 100 virtual meetings and consultations with allied capitals, officials, and experts to produce this final report. The report was presented to NATO Foreign Minister just a few weeks ago, and we are now delighted to have the opportunity to unpack some of its findings and recommendations here in the United States. To help us do that, I'm delighted to have with us the co-chairs of the NATO Reflection Group, including Dr. Thomas de Maizière, who is member of the Bundestag and previously served as Minister of Defense and Minister of the Interior for Germany. Also have our very own Dr. Wess Mitchell, who is the Vice Chair of CEPA's board and most recently served as US Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia. Welcome, Wess, great to see you again. And we're being joined from Warsaw by Professor Katarzyna Pisarska, who's a non-resident senior fellow here with us at CEPA and also the founder and director of the European Academy of Diplomacy in Warsaw, and many other impressive hats that she wears, including being the program director of the Warsaw Security Forum. It's really an honor to have CEPA serve in trying to distribute and socialize the findings of the reflection group and to support the reflection process that NATO has quite smartly taken on. Thomas, Wess, congratulations on completing this comprehensive report. Encourage everyone to read it. Look forward to diving into it here in this conversation. So with that, let me go to you, Thomas, first. One of the key tasks that the Secretary General asked the group to look at was how NATO should strengthen its political dimension. Can you talk to us in practical terms about what that means? And could you provide, from your perspective, 2 to 3 recommendations that further this aim to enhance NATO's political role in the world? Thomas, over to you.
Alina and Wess and Kasia, welcome to all of you and the listeners. Yes, it was a great challenge, but before I going to answer your question, let me say it's a great pleasure that we are here at CEPA again. I insisted that we have the first outreach in America together with Wess with CEPA and not with other think tanks. And this is not only because of CEPA, but because of the role of Wess. I'm very proud, and it was really a pleasure to work together with him. I'm glad that the American government nominated him. We became friends via Zoom and Kudu, unusual enough. And it was really great to work with him. She's so full of expertise. He knows, I think, every declaration and I don't know, summit communique from the last decades. He was fit in the Wise Men Report 1956 and the development since then. Both of us, we tried to bring our group together. We were successful in the end, and it was very much thanks to Wess' role and our relation. So thank you very much. I just wanted to say this to you as the CEO of CEPA. Now to the question. I think the famous sentence from Macron that NATO is brain death had to do with the political role, not the military one. There was a lot of progress since 2014. but the political role didn't develop in the same speed. And there was a tendency within NATO that if there are problems within NATO, don't talk to it, don't talk about it. So, and because of that, the whole discussions became ritualized, formalized, not lively, very formalized, and this is not the reason why NATO was founded. So we tried to work hard on this. We started with consultations, and we were on the listening mode, and we heard two recommendations. One was, please think out of the box, otherwise nothing will move, especially on political cohesion. And the other recommendation was, please don't think too much out of the box, then nothing will be implemented. It's so touchy. If you touch sensitive points, then you will create danger for political cohesion. So we tried to find a way between these two extreme positions, and I think our report has no extensive demands on it. It's realistic but ambitious, and that's what we wanted. So on cohesion, of course, it's a question of political will, that NATO has to be the forum, the #1 forum for security issues related to the allies and to foreign policy. And this is not the case nowadays. We know that without political will, nothing will change. But we recommended some instruments. For example, a summit. The next summit should be used to start a new updated strategic concept, and then to have a pledge for a new code of conduct. We want more informal meetings. We want more meetings not only in Brussels. We want more meetings with other ministries who are related to some issues, interior, finance, research, infrastructure, or so. We want more barbecue formats. We want quicker decision making. We will come to that perhaps later, and consensus and blockages. So to make the whole NATO more lively needs a change of the culture of debates, and this will not decrease cohesion but increase. So we want that you put the NATO from now back on the feet, not be afraid to have political discussions without an outcome, but just to like it, to inform each other before you change your security policy, to discuss arms control, to discuss on China, to build a strategy on China together, even if the result is in the beginning not clear. So I could mention a lot of recommendations in this field, but it's all about, let's make the debates more lively, more pragmatic, more behind the curtains, with another language that the people out of the family members can understand them. So this is, I think, important to increase political cohesion, and via that, the political role of NATO. Over.
Well, Thomas, thank you so much for that opening remarks, and thank you for coming to CEPA and for allowing us to be a support as you've gone through this often arduous process. I imagine certainly it was no easy task to balance the various interests of NATO member states. I think this report very much strikes a middle ground while still presenting, I do think, some out-of-the-box thinking when it comes to the future of NATO. And I know we will get to that shortly. Wes, let me go over to you. One of the recommendations in the report, as Thomas mentioned, is to create more consultation mechanisms and opportunities for allies to be able to discuss issues such as China, which of course has not been part of sort of NATO's raison d'etre, if you will. The report's very title, Adapting for a New Era, I think is very indicative in itself, but could you start by telling us about how the group characterized what this new era is for NATO, and what are some of the key features that you agreed among the group that NATO has to adapt to?
Well, thanks for that question, Alina, and thank you and CEPA for hosting Thomas and me for our first public presentation of the report in the United States. And I have to start by reciprocating Thomas's warm words. It was a great personal pleasure to operate alongside Thomas with the other fine members of the group. And I have to say, Thomas brings a strength of character and integrity and intellect to the process that not only was crucial to make a success, but I think in some small way, the cooperation and friendship that Thomas and I established was important also symbolically. It showed that the US-German relationship is alive and well. And I think it was an important part of the glue of the overall process. So it was a very great privilege to work with you, Thomas, my friend, and to be on the line together now. Alina, I think your question is fundamentally important in understanding the report, because the characterization of NATO's threat environment, how the report characterizes that really cuts to the heart of what it then goes on to call for in terms of recommendations, which all hinge on a theme of strategic adaptation. The premise of the report is that strategic adaptation is required in order for NATO to survive and thrive. And of course, that's true of all organizations. You can't operate really an organization of any size without understanding and intelligently relating to your surroundings. But I think that's especially true of an alliance like NATO, and it's especially true at a moment like today. And of course, Stoltenberg asked us to look out to 2030, so over the next decade. I think it becomes foundationally important to get your characterization of the threat environment right in a very, very fluid moment in international geopolitics and economics, to understand what is the fundamental purpose and what are the priorities to be for this alliance. And of course, NATO has a firm foundation to stand on. I think its longevity is the result of its ability to accurately read the cues of its external environment and then take on changes accordingly. And at certain moments in NATO's history, those changes have been very profound. And I would just stress that act of strategic adaptation is a deliberate act, and it is a political act that every few generations, NATO re-examines how its surroundings have changed. Of course, it retains foundational aspects of its purpose and principles, but it changes on the basis of changes in the environment. And that's the key. I would also stress, and the report traces this lineage in its preamble, in the preamble of the report, is that adaptation has been political and not just military in NATO's history. So you see, for example, the political adaptation that came in the 50s with the Wiseman report and after the Suez crisis. You see it again in the 60s and the Harmel report after the loss of US nuclear dominance. And then you see it, of course, more recently after the end of the Cold War and then after 9/11 and so on. So I think our report can be understood in that lineage of deliberative modification in NATO's political attributes to match changes or cues from its environment. And the environment, the threat environment that you've asked about, that we see coming into view over the next decade, is one that is, I think, radically different in many regards from either the immediate post-Cold War environment, where there were no real peer competitors to the West at all, or the Cold War era, where there was one military and ideological challenge. The environment that's coming into view, in America, we often call it great power competition. In Europe, it's often called systemic rivalry, but it's an era where there are large, well-resourced, capable actors that act as the main external threats to NATO, but it's more than one, and they have a different character. And I think that golden thread of recognizing that sort of that leitmotif of the emerging era is one of the strongest features of the report. And the main message of the report is that NATO's priority has to be to prepare itself for that new era, that it includes a militarily assertive Russia, which of course we're all accustomed to, but also a rising China, which is less familiar to us, but that competition with these states is not only material in nature, it's also political and ideological. These are both large Eurasian land powers that are led by the world's leading authoritarian regimes. So the report proceeds from the strategic logic dealing with those factors in your threat environment that possess the greatest capabilities to inflict harm or disruption, that is of primary importance, and that the ability to deal with other secondary threats and problems is derivative of that central task. And I think that's important to state up front because it gets at the fundamental sort of why of NATO, that it points to the fact that NATO is the only organization that can be the principal venue for organizing the West for sustained competition with these large rivals. I think it's also important because any strategic document that does not clearly delineate priorities and recognize trade-offs is of limited practical value. But the thing I would stress, finally, is just that this point that strategic competition with Russia and China it points to a very different character of threat environment or setting than NATO has known since the end of the Cold War, when it has really become focused for good reason on a combination of out-of-area operations, crisis management. It's not a criticism to say that. It's simply to say that that threat environment is tilting back towards a much more intensive and competitive geopolitical arena. And the report says, in essence, to survive and succeed, NATO has to fundamentally prepare for that as the main feature of its environment.
Thank you, Wes. I want to take it over to Kasia to give you an opportunity to respond, but I think I would highlight a few of the things that you just mentioned. One, it has been incredible to see NATO adapt as part of its history, as part of its legacy, as an organization that went from having 12 members at its founding to now 30 members. I mean, that in itself, that rate of growth for a defense and security alliance requires strategic adaptation. NATO has been undertaking these kinds of reflection processes throughout its history, with the recognition that to stay relevant, to serve the intent and the mission of the membership group, it has to constantly adapt through these strategic processes. So I think very much the process that you and Thomas have undertaken and other group members have undertaken is very much of NATO's history of adaptation, successful adaptation to a constantly shifting threat environment. But I think one of the other issues, because you mentioned that NATO should be the principal venue for organizing the West, and I think that's key. And Kasia, this is where I want to go over to you, because of course, one of the most prominent linkages that we have in this so-called Western community is a commitment to common values, and those common values undergird the NATO alliance as well: democracy, individual liberty, and rule of law. Of course, we can't deny that there are some significant challenges to those principles today, even within NATO itself. And I want to take it over to you to comment on what Wes and Thomas have initially laid out, but specifically talking about what role should values play. And of course, the report talks about it extensively, makes quite a few recommendations in that front. But what is the role of values when it comes to NATO's strategic adaptation, as Wes put it?
Thank you very much, Alina. Thank you for the invitation. And first and foremost, I want to congratulate Thomas and Wes for an excellent report. It is an interesting, engaging, and at the same time comprehensive report, which looks through a variety of different issues. And many of them are of particular importance also to my region, the Central European region, but I'll be happy to comment on this a bit later. But coming to your question, the report just like the NATO treaty underlines again and again, that NATO is not just simply a military alliance. It has embraced a strong political role, and that role, in order for the role to be executed, we need a common strategic vision. Of course, we need shared interest, but also we need common shared. We need to become a community of shared values, and these values also in this report, when talking about the vision of NATO moving forward, the report states very clearly that NATO's role should be to uphold its role as the bedrock of peace, stability, and rule of law in the Euro-Atlantic area. Why is this important? Because without acknowledging and committing to these values, including rule of law, it's very easy to exploit by other powers, including the authoritarian powers that Wes was talking about, China and Russia, to exploit these political divergences. If we cannot agree on these basic principles on which the NATO alliance is founded, then of course these divergences are going to grow in the long term. And for Central Europe, this is specifically important because we have a relatively short history of, let's say, modern democracy. We're talking about 30 years of building from scratch, from communism, democratic systems to a large extent very, very successfully, yes, and in an incredibly quick speed. But the challenge is that you cannot skip certain phases. You cannot skip the phase of educating populations on, for example, what separation of power is. You can't skip certain phases of really living democracy as it is. And because of this relatively short episode of democracy, which I hope is going to last for many, many years to come, it's also much easier to undermine some of these democratic principles in some Central European states. And of course, this is usually done by politicians doing it for self-serving interests. So I would say it is absolutely primordial and important for us to really have this discussion on values. Of course, NATO is not the European Union. It has a limited role in executing whether a country actually abides to rule of law, whether the democratic standards are met. So it can serve only, but maybe it is already a lot, as a platform for political pressure. And I think a key role of NATO is to explain that this is also a pragmatic reason why we're upholding these values. This is not only some kind of ideological reason, but pragmatic, that without common understanding what the NATO alliance is based and what are the things we share together, these divergences can be exploited by actors that are not friendly to us, and it will actually weaken the cohesion of the alliance and definitely not strengthen it politically.
Kasia, you bring us some really important points that actually speak to the question I was going to pose to Thomas next, and that of course has to do with the question of NATO-EU cooperation. Which you just alluded to. What is the role of NATO? What is the role of the EU? And where do the two alliances, the two multilateral organizations intersect and also play a force multiplier role? You know, Thomas, I don't have to tell you that we've seen some incredibly robust debates playing out over the last years, whether or not Europe should take a more strategic, autonomous path. The debate on strategic autonomy has become quite live and has been exacerbated, I think, by the pandemic as well. How does this report tackle this question, particularly alongside continuing calls for more equal burden sharing, which will likely persist, throughout U.S. politics for this administration and administrations to come after this one?
Well, please allow me some two remarks in advance what have been said. One on what you've said about adaptation. Yes, it's true, and we underlined it in the report, and Wes mentioned it, that adaptation is so far a strength of NATO, if you look to history. But we say now it's a necessity as well. if NATO fails to adapt the new global situation in the world, then NATO will get really in trouble, at least in the political role. So this is a critical phase, and this is the reason why the debate on strategic concept and NATO 2030 is absolutely crucial, because NATO has to prove the strength for adaptation, and otherwise it will be difficult. Now on values, second remark, we discussed it at length, and it's a sensitive issue. There are some countries where within NATO where you can have a lot of discussions about values and the status of democracy and so on and so forth. We devoided fingerprinting in the report, but you can read it if you want. So if you differentiate between, this is what Kasia mentioned, the influences from outside NATO, there we are extremely clear. We don't want these influences. We want that NATO has more resilience. A Center for Democratic Resilience, this was an idea of Wess, by the way, in person. It's very good to deal with these issues. This is difficult to handle with, but it's easier than the second question, challenges and dangers from inside. And there, we have had tough discussions within the group, but we are not the European Union. We don't have sanctions. NATO survived the dictatorship in Greece for a long time. So there, my personal advice, as a person, not as co-chair of the group, I would advise ourselves to be pragmatic and not too moral teachers for each other. There are difficult cultures. For example, in Germany, there are a lot of discussions about the voting system in America. And of course, in America, you have discussions about some tendencies in Europe. And we have within the European Union discussions about Poland and Hungary. We should not put these discussions in the center of NATO. This was really decrease political cohesion without an additional effect. So if there are problems, we have to address them. That's clear. But NATO is not, first of all, a moral instance. Now on your question, NATO-EU. This is interesting enough. And there, of course, we have had a lot of discussion in the group. I see a tendency in America that there are concerns that the European Union, under the chapeau strategic autonomy, well, could develop a strength besides of NATO. And this is a matter of concern. The reality is, and I very often put it to the discussion of the group, that the reality is far, far away from this concern. There is 100% more talking than acting in the European Union. So yeah, that's the reality. 100% less talking and 100% more acting would be good for the European Union and NATO. So we quoted in the report that strategic autonomy, if you want to use it, I'm not a friend of this. I'm really a transatlantic person. But if you want to use this, then okay, then you can mean Europe should do more for their own security within NATO, but this should be developed within NATO under the rules of interoperability and so on and so forth. But what we see is that there is a lot of wording on the top level about excellent relations between NATO and the EU, and nothing like this happens below this level. There is reluctance. They don't like each other. They don't meet enough. Some are arrogant. Some have complexes, so they don't feel strong enough, and they don't behave like real partners and friends. And so our recommendation is that we need to restart in these relations to make them more honest and more pragmatic and really a cooperation. And the starting point should be something like a summit. It's difficult because of Turkey, Cyprus, and so on, but I call it something like a summit. So I think this is necessary, and burden sharing. I think we of course recalled the demand for burden sharing. 2% and 20% for research shouldn't be changed. But of course, this was not our mandate. But relations to BIP, GDP is not the only criterion. Germany wants to talk more about capabilities, not only about money. And I think this is the interest of the United States of America as well. If Europe talks about the capabilities within NATO, not only about money. But burden sharing, and I always told my European friends, the Biden administration will be tougher for us because the tone is more friendly. And it was an excuse for Europe to say, well, there's Trump and we don't like this tone and attitude, and so we don't have to go into substance. Now there's a friend coming, and with the same substance, with a different tone. And this makes it for us in Europe and Germany more difficult, but I welcome this.
Well, Thomas, you put a lot on the table that I want to pick up on, particularly about the obvious change that's coming in the United States and what that might mean for Europe and NATO, especially whether the US, we I think know already that the Biden administration, as you said, will be a friendlier force and a friendlier face for Europeans. But how will that shift perhaps the US focus, US leadership in NATO? What should be the top priorities that the US with a friendlier face should champion going forward? Wes, I want to give you an opportunity to perhaps respond to this conversation that Kasia started about NATO-EU cooperation that Thomas just elaborated on, and to fill in perhaps some key recommendations the report makes on that dimension that Thomas already started to outline. It's interesting that Thomas mentioned that the Democratic Resilience Center was one of your ideas, Wes, that you wanted to incorporate into the report. Obviously, it's a consensus document, but I'm curious to hear more about how you see that particular mechanism being a avenue for greater EU-NATO consultations and discussions going forward. Anything you want to touch on from the US perspective as well?
Alina, let me just start with a remark on Wes again. He's a Republican. Of course, everybody knows that. But he was absolutely fair within the process to make it bipartisan in America. And he was quite close to the Biden camp, as he told me. So the concern sometimes in Europe that this report is worthless because Wess Mitchell was a Republican is totally stupid, and everybody knows it. So the new government will welcome this report as the actual one did it. And this is because of the fairness and the good procedures of Wes.
Thank you, Thomas. I couldn't agree with you more. I think anyone who reads this report and takes the time to do so will see that the recommendations there are not in any way, could be framed in any way as being partisan. Their recommendations, they're very much about our national interests in the US and of course the broader strategic interests of the alliance. And I had no doubt that Wes would serve the US national interest as effectively as he has. So Wes, let me take it over to you to respond to what Thomas has said.
Well, Thomas is very charitable to say that. I hope he's ultimately right in that assessment. But I will say that I think we went to great lengths as a group to offer recommendations that were politically and practically plausible. And what I mean is, we were, of course, aware of the upcoming election in the United States, but also political currents in Europe and debates in governments inside Europe. And I think all the members of our group, and it was certainly true of me on the US side because of our elections, tried to make sure that what we would offer is something that would have the greatest odds possible of attracting political traction and support. And in the US case, that required something that I would imagine would be the responsibility of any American in a group like this, is to ensure that the inputs are as bipartisan as possible. Alina, as you know, I ran a contact group, an informal group of former US officials from both Republican and Democratic administrations. Also reached out a lot in Congress, in the Senate and the House, and both among R's and D's. And of course, I also made a point of briefing both the current administration and what was then the potential for a future Biden administration to make sure everybody had a chance to understand the approach, but also shape it. So some of the specific recommendations in the report came from incoming members of the incoming administration or members of Congress. I tried to ensure it had a fair hearing, and I think that's just important for any rep on a group like this, but especially the U.S. rep. And I will say anecdotally, I think from my briefings, I mean, I wouldn't presume to speak for the incoming administration, but I do think from the conversations I've had that the report is understood and supported among incoming administration officials. I think it's seen as embodying a set of U.S. interests and values. And besides also that it looks out to 2030. So I think those are hopefully virtues of the report. The question that's being discussed about NATO and the European Union, of course, was a major preoccupation for the group. The fact is that in the 10 years since Madeleine Albright and Jerome Vanderveer ran the group of experts in 2010, the European Union has developed more of a message about its separateness or its autonomy as a strategic actor. The group debated that at length. It's not entirely always clear what is meant by the term strategic autonomy. I think that's still being worked out. And the group wanted to look at this question, NATO-EU, the same way it looks at all other questions, major questions in the report, and that is through the prism of what will most strengthen the West or consolidate the West strategically and politically by 2030, and then reason backwards. And so I think if you read the report, you see a very fair and professional tone in the European Union. It acknowledges that the European Union has certain attributes or ambitions as a security actor. It welcomes those attributes insofar as they strengthen NATO capabilities. So of course, this would not be the moment in history to want to see the Western world splinter or bifurcate into separate political organisms or poles. So the report is balanced and cautious on this, but it welcomes greater European security capabilities in the vein of strengthening the West as a whole, but calls upon the European Union, as it has indeed committed in letter and in spirit in the past, to ensure that those activities are carried out in a way that doesn't duplicate NATO or discriminate against non-EU member states. And I think that's a very prudential and judicious admonition on the part of the report. You asked about the Center for Democratic Resilience. As Thomas said, the report litigates or aerates, and certainly the group discussed at great length the question of political currents inside the Western world. It is a consensus report. And I think if you look at NATO's history, there have been a number of moments, actually much greater tests of democracy inside NATO and the Western world than we face today. Thomas mentioned the Greek military junta of the late 1960s, early 70s. You could add to that the fact that one of the founding states of NATO, Portugal, was actually under an open dictatorship at the time of the founding of the Washington Treaty. And of course, there's the case of Turkey, which throughout the 70s and 80s had at least 3 or 4 major military coups, even executed their prime minister at one point. All of which is to say, NATO must remain cognizant of and tend to the bases of its strength as a alliance of democratic states. And the report is crystal clear on that. I think it mentions democracy more than 50 times. But there is also a council of practicality that Thomas is, I think, eloquently articulating, that it has to be mindful of the gaps that can exist inside NATO and be exploited by external rivals. This was true throughout the Cold War, and it's true today, and that often requires a balancing act. But I think one thing that the report is clear about is that NATO can and should develop tools to assist those members whose public institutions are under pressure from external actors like Russia and China. And I think it's particularly true of some of the more vulnerable states in NATO that perhaps lack capacity to buck up some of those institutions. It's entirely appropriate for NATO to offer that support. It's also appropriate for NATO, as the report calls for the Secretary General to conduct periodic, maybe annual assessments of the political health of the organization. We call for a new accord or a code of conduct to hold to the principles of the Washington Treaty. So I think we struck that balance in a way that is both in keeping with the history of how NATO has approached domestic affairs, but also in a way that's cognizant of the competitive environment that we operate under, that the goal at the end of the day is to strengthen deterrence. And you're doing that in a fluid environment where you have very purposeful and aggressive external actors. And part of effective deterrence is having crystal clarity on the political will to defend all of your allies, irrespective of what's happening internally. And I think the balance, the report strikes that balance fairly well.
Wes, actually, I wanted to stick for a second with one of those external challenges that has come up a few times in the context of this conversation. And let me stick with you, and then I want to take it over to Kasia to comment and to talk a little bit more about her assessment of the report's specific strength when it comes to the region where she comes from, certainly Central Eastern Europe, but on China specifically. One of the key headlines that came out of the report is that NATO needs to lean in on the China challenge. And perhaps as part of that, and this was something that most NATO watchers were expecting, that NATO needs to update its strategic concept as well, with the original one now being a decade old. Can you talk a little bit more about China specifically, and to what extent in some of your deliberations you saw a consensus? Because we have had a situation for some time where we haven't had a great deal of consensus within Europe about how NATO, but also how European member states should be addressing the China challenge when it comes to technology, when it comes to technology associated with defense, of course, that affects all of our national security interests. So help us think through those two pieces, the China piece and the strategic concept.
Well, I have to commend Thomas for being a persistent voice in the group and making the case for an update to the strategic concept. I think it's right and overdue. Of course, some allies have been uncomfortable about updating the strategic concept, but when you consider that it was created at a moment before the rise of China really began to accelerate. So China isn't even mentioned. It was drafted before Russia went into Ukraine and says very little on terrorism. I think it's overdue. It's important that be done in a judicious fashion. I think the report gives a framework that stops short of exceeding our mandate. So we don't presume to deliberate on the deep content of the strategic concept, but we do give a framework for what could be retained from the old one, and some pointers to what might need to be updated. So I think that's entirely appropriate and overdue, and I'm hopeful that NATO will move forward with that. I think China, perforce, will be a significant focal point of any updated strategic concept within NATO. The rise of China as among, or perhaps soon to be, the foremost economic power in the world, but also a major military actor, is by far the single greatest change in NATO's strategic environment when you look out to 2030. And that came up over and over in our briefings from experts, civilian or military, our consultations with all 30 NATO allied capitals. China came up early and often. And an observation that I have from that is, while I often read in newspapers over the last several months about a great divergence between the United States and Europe on the question of China, I just did not witness that in the group. Of course, there were debates about how much emphasis to place, how to characterize China. Of course, the report points out that China is a crucial economic partner to Western countries and will continue to be. But I found no reluctance at all on the part of the group to have clarity on the nature of Chinese behavior as an authoritarian state, as a state that brings its economic pressure to bear for political ends, and as a state that has growing military reach, and which is to say, China is not only an economic or Asia-specific actor. In fact, we heard repeatedly in our deliberations from allied capitals that China is now actively undermining NATO cohesion in critical ways, that it's operating inside the Euro-Atlantic area. So I think the counsel of the report on the subject of China is very pragmatic, and it starts by acknowledging if the mission of NATO is to secure its the members of that alliance, in fact, China now as a state actor is behaving in ways that require greater security and greater attention. And we spell out some of those. So I think the call for a comprehensive political strategy vis-a-vis China that, for example, has a framework for protecting infrastructure, communications links, et cetera, internal to the Euro-Atlantic area is entirely overdue and is appropriate, and is probably where NATO is already trending. Hopefully this will be a kind of spur in that direction. And secondly, and finally, I think the admonition to create a consultative body, should NATO elect to do so, internal to NATO, but perhaps when it is appropriate, bringing in other entities, be it the European Union or others. The point should be that the Western world needs a platform or a venue where it is reviewing and discussing and debating policies on China. Even if we're not always operationalizing NATO on China, it would be a salutary development for the alliance to develop that capacity. And I think the sooner the better. So I think the report came out in a good place on that. And I think we had a lot of amity in the group on those subjects.
Thank you, Wes. And we're getting close to wrapping up our time, believe it or not. But before we move towards our final lightning round of questions, Kasia, I want to take it over to you. We started talking about China. Of course, from where you sit in Warsaw, I would imagine Russia continues to be a top concern for countries on NATO's eastern flank. What are some of the takeaways you got from the report in terms of the recommendations around how perhaps NATO's eastern flank should be strengthened, and where the Russia challenge will continue to fit in to NATO's potentially new strategic concept in the years ahead?
Absolutely. You know, I think the report is going to be and is very warmly welcomed in Central Europe for the very reason that we understand it's going to inform the new strategic concept. And as Wes said, the strategic concept we have from 2010 is absolutely outdated. It was a pre-Crimea document. The world has changed immensely since then, and our viewers know it very well. But so from a Central European perspective, I think there's 5 elements that are of critical importance in this specific report. First of all, recognizing Russia as the main military threat to NATO. That is clearly said out loud with a dual track policy proposed by the report. That is also welcome, but Russia is recognized as this threat. Second, recognizing of the return of geopolitical competition. Yes, which includes not only Russia, but China. Geopolitical competition is very well understood in this part of the world. We have always been for the good and usually for the bad in some kind of sphere of influence, and that thinking also is well understood, and we recognize that this is the new reality, and the report also recognizes it. Number 3 is the continual commitment for NATO forward presence, of course, strengthening the eastern flank. And number 4, very important, we tend to forget about this. The report talks about it, I think, only in 1 or 2 places, but continuing the open door policy of NATO. It has been a fact, but to underline that NATO's doors are open to those who share our values, our strategic interests, our vision of the world, I think that's critical. And last, of course, calling for NATO's greater role in emerging disruptive technologies, in hybrid threats. These are the elements that Central Europe sometimes lags behind. We might have experience in fighting disinformation, but then of course, because the level of innovation is sometimes too weak, having this kind of joint effort to actually deal with emerging disruptive technologies is very important. Let me also say that there's 3 elements that of course when Central Europeans will also commit, but maybe they're not as they'll be more backbenchers. I think EU-NATO cooperation is one of them. This is a welcome development, as the report states. If NATO and EU works together, this is a tremendous force for good. Of course, the commitment to annual defense spending. Many of the countries, Poland, Estonia, but generally the Baltic states, continue its higher spending than the majority of NATO members. So that is also welcome. And last, energy security. I found this specifically interesting because, of course, there are organizations like the EU, which have immense regulatory powers and which are truly helpful in terms of dealing with energy security. But having this also as a NATO priority in the report is, I think, a very welcome development for Central Europeans, because they are specifically those members that are dependent mainly on Russia gas in this region, and doing more together in this area is definitely critical. So a lot of good news for Central Europeans. And last thing, as I said, there will be, however, some political divergences. These will be, of course, around threat perceptions. I think, the report talks about the South, terrorism, climate change. These are the things that we don't think enough about in Central Europe, because our threat perceptions are a bit different. But I think we have to start thinking about this, and bringing this into the report is critical also for us to see these threats as critical for NATO. And the second thing we talked about, values. That is the question of how we actually define, this question of rule of law. And I have to, as my very last word said, that when it comes to values, I'm not sure if I'm fully convinced when it comes to this comparison, if this is an adequate comparison of how NATO was able to, live with authoritarian member states during the Cold War. I think the realities of the Cold War were that we had a very clear ideological opponent, and the ideology of this opponent was communism. I can't imagine having a communist member state as a member state of NATO. Yes, this ideology was very clear. Now I think we have to redefine, because Wess says we now have also ideological opponents. We need to redefine what their ideology is. And I think their ideology is not communism or any other, let's say, well-known ideology. It's just pure authoritarianism. Yes, and it's many forms. And I think in the long term, NATO, just like the West, cannot afford making big compromises in a time where we're actually fighting, also with ideas. If we walk the talk, if we actually stand up for these values, because if we don't, how different are we from China? How different are we from Russia? What really makes us different? So although I fully respect the pragmatic approach, I also acknowledge how much the word rule of law and democracy appears in this report. So this is, also amazing. But I'm not sure if that argument is as convincing, today as it might have been even still, 10 or 20 years ago when we look back in the history of NATO.
Well, Kasia, as we're nearing the end of our conversation, I think you've just raised the level of our discussion about the strategic ideological battle that we find ourselves in today, and this kind of threat environment that underpins. Thomas, my final question to you. One, love to get you to respond to what Kasia just said, to the extent that you'd like to. And two, very briefly, I think one of the other headline grabbing parts of the report to me, which Kasia just mentioned as well, was the report's focus on emerging and disruptive technologies. which I think is perhaps one of the most important issue sets looking into 2030. And that naturally speaks to the challenge that Wess just took us through, which is how NATO addresses China, which of course is increasingly competing with the broader West and with NATO especially on its deployment and development of new emerging and disruptive technologies in fields such as artificial intelligence and its applications to defense technology in particular. Thomas, let me let you decide which elements of everything that's been put on the table in this discussion you would like to respond to. The floor is yours.
Thank you. First, to Kasia, it would be a miracle if everybody agrees to everything. So it's fine that you're criticizing this in a very moderate way. At least I wanted to remind you that Tsipras, Prime Minister in Greece, was quite a left socialist, close to communist, and had a coalition with right populist party, and even Europe survived that. So in these times, but I know the comparison is a bit unfair, but I agree to disagree that pragmatism here is our point of view, and you are more critical for good reasons. Now, on a second remark, I wanted to repeat the threat perceptions, and this Kasia was right to mention that. The thing is that it is impossible for NATO in the global situation we live in, with 30 allies, to find a new one single issue threat perception. This will not be the case. And so the challenge is how to have NATO together to strengthen the cohesion with different threat perceptions. This is the challenge. And to try to, and sometimes in Central Europe or Eastern Europe, I feel that there is a dream, let's go back to the old threat perception, Russia, everything about Russia. This is not the case. And this will not be the case in the future. There's Africa, there's South, there's High North, and so on, and there's China. So the challenge is how to deal with a different threat perception and still have cohesion within NATO. This is a challenge, and we wanted to describe that. Now on EDTs, this is really, and if you ask me what are the three main recommendations, if you may say so, this is number one is NATO has to change the culture of debate to be the forum for security issues in the West, number one. Number two is China, and number three is EDT. And this is of utmost importance. There is a lot going on the committee level. There is an advisory group there working on this, and we know that, but it's not really a political issue on the top level. This is just not the case, and it should be the case. I would guess that that the leaders of China and Putin discuss on EDTs in their inner political circle more than the majority of the prime ministers and heads of states in the West. That would be my guess. I cannot prove that. That would be my guess. It's not a technical issue. It's a political one. Where are the vulnerabilities for security on space, on infrastructure, on cyber? This is really a political issue. So we recommend a digital summit together with the private sector, just to have a push in all committees, in all the councils, in the whole spectrum of NATO, not only for military capabilities, but for political reasons. And this is, I think, one of the top three of our recommendations. So hopefully we will not discuss the report in the next months only, but what has to be implemented and what will Jens Stoltenberg put in his report and challenge it. There, again, perhaps we need the help of the think tankers preparing the summit.
Well, Thomas, thank you. That was an incredible summary of the report. And of course, the process going forward will be for the Secretary General to consider the recommendations that are made in this report and think through which ones NATO will go forward in implementing. Wes, I would like to give you the final word here. The focus on EDTs, emerging disruptive technologies, that Thomas just highlighted, I think is so critical for NATO going forward, and is very much one of the top three issue areas and recommendation areas the report really zeroes in on. Would you comment on that to fill out what Thomas already put on the table in terms of a digital summit to be held together with private companies? I think that is an absolutely critical and urgent task for NATO to take up as we look forward into the next 10 years. What would you highlight as your top three? And they can be the same as Thomas's from the report in terms of the key areas, the key recommendations for NATO.
Well, to your first question, Alina, I would say on emerging disruptive technologies, this is one of the cornerstone areas of focus of the report. The primary message here is that maintaining a technological edge is the foundation upon which NATO's ability to defend its publics and societies ultimately rests. So acquisition of and access to, for example, artificial intelligence, autonomous capabilities, quantum computing, et cetera, will profoundly reshape the security environment over the next decade, perhaps in ways that are not fully understood in many NATO states. And that makes emerging and disruptive technologies very much NATO's business. As such, what the report says in essence, I mean, first and foremost, it states plainly that NATO must see competing with the efforts underway by large authoritarian states to achieve dominance in key technologies as a central task of the coming decade. It's not one that can be deprioritized or just pushed to the member states. And then it gives 10 recommendations for that, for how to go about that. I think Thomas, as always, has eloquently articulated some of the main recommendations, but I would just highlight the need for NATO to develop a kind of coordinating function that I think has been missing, but to spur collaboration among allies on the security dimensions of EDTs. It's actually somewhat surprising at present that no transatlantic coordination tool exists for that purpose. And NATO is really the only platform that can perform that role. That when you consider that most of the security relevant AI applications, well, all of them, are derivatives of the accessibility of a very large data pool that would drive these advances. It behooves the Western world to find ways going into the next decade where we are reducing the barriers for data to be utilized in the West. And obviously that requires a conversation with the European Union. But for NATO to be a driver of or create a platform for that, I think is key. Two, I think the need to anchor emerging and disruptive technologies in the defense planning process, the NDPP, is absolutely crucial if the West wants to avoid falling behind, and it has to be part of the burden sharing discussion. And then three, I think the message that we have to develop a long-term game plan for countering China's military civil fusion strategy in Europe is really crucial. China acquires intellectual property and technological advances for its military, in part by feeding on the intellectual resources inter alia of NATO states. So the report calls for a NATO framework to alert allies to these practices. I think it's the report's emphasis on securing NATO equipment and infrastructure to protect it from penetration, and then encouraging allies to prioritize security technological cooperation with other allies. All of that is important and probably overdue, as is the call for kind of North Atlantic equivalent of DARPA or the European Defense Fund. So the idea that spurring innovation in strategic sectors among allies should be part and parcel of NATO's work, I think is a key message of the report. I mean, I think if you had to highlight a couple of the recommendations that are the most important in the report, I would just say two. One is developing this consultative body to deal with the China question and of course, the associated strategic framework and the structured collaboration with the countries of the Indo-Pacific. I think that package of recommendations is crucial and prescient. And then I think refining the decision-making process, and in particular, raising the threshold to single country blockages and also the time limiting of crisis decision-making to avoid paralysis in the alliance. I think that bundle of recommendations are absolutely crucial because, again, we're talking about a threat environment of 2 or 3 major threats with 30, maybe eventually more allies. I think it becomes much more incumbent on the alliance to ensure that it continues making decisions quickly and isn't locked up in the event of a crisis.
Well, Wes, that was a tour de force overview. The report has so much more to dig into. We weren't expecting to get through everything in the time we had together, but I think certainly the focus areas that you and Thomas have outlined are the big takeaways, especially your elaboration on the EDT question and the need for greater transatlantic cooperation, for there to be a mechanism and an avenue not to block off our cooperation, especially when it comes to data sharing, but to enhance openness between Europe and the United States within the alliance for greater data sharing to build on when it comes to technological development and especially artificial intelligence systems of all kinds. Thomas, Wes, congratulations again on this comprehensive, in-depth report that also has this very sophisticated and elegant way of striking a balance between thinking outside the box, but still within the NATO framework, as you, I think, so elegantly put it at the onset of this conversation, Thomas. I think there will be a lot of debate, but certainly already the report has been stirring up what are profound conversations about NATO's future that are long overdue given all the changes we've seen in the last 10 years and the challenges we have facing us in the years ahead. Kasia, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for providing the viewpoint from Warsaw as well. When it comes to the report, encourage everyone to read the report themselves to get out of it what you think is interesting. Feel free to please follow us on Twitter at CEPA, where we'll be sharing out more and more on this issue around NATO, around security and defense. And I look forward to seeing how the rest of the NATO 2030 process unfolds and to watching how your work, Thomas, Wes, and Kasia will shape the alliance for the next decade. Thank you so much for taking the time. It was really my pleasure and CEPA's honor to be able to host this discussion. Thomas, Wes, Kasia, wishing you a restful holiday break wherever you find yourselves in Europe, in the United States, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alina.
Thank you, Alina, so much. Thank you.